A very warm welcome to everyone on behalf of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, as well as the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and DGAP. It's a real pleasure for me to have all of you here today to discuss some of the main insights of the Kennedy School of the Belfer Center and DGAP's co-chaired report, Stronger Together, a strategy to revive transatlantic power. We have several of the authors here of the group, the strategy group that drafted this report. But rather than going into a discussion of the report itself, what we thought might be more interesting would be really that of discussing some of the main themes raised by the report, and perhaps by sort of starting out by setting sort of out two of the main questions which have emerged as sort of key elements of the transatlantic debate in recent weeks and days. I'm thinking here in particular about the sort of conversations and discussions raised and elaborated also last week during the Munich Security Conference, where President Biden made sort of key remarks concerning the way in which the transatlantic relationship should deal with authoritarian powers such as Russia or China, and in which President Macron again raised the question of European strategic autonomy and the way in which that combines or otherwise with a revamped transatlantic relationship. So I would really like to start with those sort of two main questions. So on the one hand, is European strategic autonomy incompatible with or mutually reinforcing with a strengthened transatlantic relationship? And secondly, sort of broadening out globally, how is it that liberal democracies in the United States and in Europe should be addressing a world in the sense of sort of a non-liberal world in which liberal and illiberal powers are going to coexist, and at times they will compete, at other times they will cooperate, and where is it that they have to compete and where is it that they have to cooperate? So let me perhaps begin by bringing in Anthony Gardner in this discussion. Tony, to sort of ask you, particularly with an economic lens, an economic transatlantic lens, if you could perhaps bring in some of your insights on some of these questions. Tony.
Sure, happy to. It's wonderful to be participating in this session. So let me try to be brief in the next 5 to 7 minutes on the trade and economic agenda. Look, there are enormous domestic challenges clearly in the United States, but that doesn't mean that there isn't bandwidth to engage with our key allies, particularly Europe and European Union specifically on trade and economics. I'm feeling pretty bullish that there's a broad and there's a deep agenda, and I'm feeling optimistic, particularly because the EU released its white paper that is aligned very much with the thinking during the Biden campaign. There is going to be a honeymoon, but let's not kid ourselves. The honeymoon won't last forever. It may even be brief. There are some hand grenades lying around, particularly on digital services tax, particularly hand grenades on public procurement issue that's come up recently, privacy shield negotiations, and there's some others. But we have to prove the case over the next 4 years that we can get more done together for our voters than the Trump way of working bilaterally and transactionally and often undermining allies. And I'm confident that we can. So on trade issues, look, I don't think there's any desire, nor is there any bandwidth to try a TTIP 2.0, in which I was involved and many others were on this call. There is limited appetite in general in the United States for new ambitious trade deals. President Biden has said so specifically on the campaign and recently. He said, I'm not going to enter into any new trade agreement with anybody until we have made major investments here at home and in our workers and in our education. And Janet Yellen said very similar things. The focus will be on enforcement of existing agreements, on domestic content requirements, which I mentioned before, on a corporate tax penalty on companies that engage in offshoring, and on improving resilience and diversification of supply chains. But, and here's the but, we can work together to address some of the issues you were talking about. First of all, how do we create jobs for our middle class? And here I'm confident that we can eliminate tariffs on industrial goods trade. That's part of what we did in TTIP. And see some movement from the EU on some agricultural items. I'm not mentioning, I'm not referring to some of the more difficult issues. I'm referring to some of the more specific issues relating to plant and animal health, which is not, not impossible to do. We can clean up some of the wreckage from the past. And here I have in mind particularly the steel and aluminum tariffs in return for lifting of EU counter sanctions, and some of the other tariffs that in my view were improperly applied during the Trump years. And that leads us to the bigger point that I think this is really now time to wipe the slate clean, to start afresh, particularly on Boeing and Airbus, which has been going on for 16 years. And the time is now to really get a global agreement on the way forward. Luckily, now we've agreed on the new Director General for the WTO, and now we have to lift, hopefully we will now lift, the veto on the dispute settlement body at the WTO. And that's important, obviously, because we need to make it work. We need to make the WTO work if we're going to do what I said at the beginning, that is to prove that the multilateral system actually is capable of delivering results. We now need to reform the rules that have not been reformed and are in desperate need of reform. A question mark whether, with the UK, whether we can make some progress. I hope we can, particularly on digital financial services. I think there are some things we can do on plurilateral trade agreements, particularly given the green agenda to reopen the environmental goods agreement, very important, eliminating tariffs on green goods. Very important as well, talking about wiping the slate clean and ensuring that there's a honeymoon here, to see if we can get to a global agreement at the OECD on global digital taxation rules. Super important. We made some progress on part of it, but on the key one regarding the rights of countries to tax sales of digital services provided to consumers inside their countries when there isn't a physical presence, that remains open, and it's important we agree so that individual member states don't go ahead, like France, like UK and others, with their own systems, which would balkanize the world taxation rules. But more globally, and here's where I really want to put the emphasis, there is a lot we can do together on digital economy issues. Very important. What do I have in mind? Promoting the transparency and accountability of our online platforms. And here I'm thinking, should companies, especially those with market power, be more transparent about their policies, especially about their AI-generated algorithms? Should there be more accountability through third-party verification of those policies? Should there be audits, third-party audits of AI, the artificial intelligence black box? Should we not work more together to combat the dissemination of illegal or harmful content and protect the integrity of our elections, especially through the bots and the deep fakes? And should we not work together better to ensure that our media is alive and healthy? And here I'm thinking particularly about what's going on in Australia, which may be picked up, by the way, in not only the EU, but in Canada, and even perhaps in the United States and the UK. Should we not really think about the rules of how we arbitrate between the providers of content and those online platforms? Over the last 4 years, the United States has been away without leave, as we say, AWOL. We have not been legislating. The EU has been setting the rules of the road. I don't think that's right. I think we should engage with the EU right now. And now is a crucial moment that the EU is in the process of rolling out its Digital Services Act and its Digital Markets Act, which will define the rules of the road in this regard. And we should together consider whether competition rules are fit for purpose. Are they enough, or should we think of other rules that will ensure that innovation continues as strong as before? And here I'm thinking about a US-EU Trade and Technology Council to discuss all of these issues. So that really is, I think, an important part of the agenda. The last thing I'll say before closing, I would put at the very top, the top 3 issues to bring us together in the next 4 years. Working together on WTO reform, particularly on Chinese trade, abusive investment and market access practices. Very important. There's a lot that we can do. We're not going to agree on everything for sure, but the EU white paper published a while ago has a lot of good ideas. I suspect we agree on a lot of what's in there. And I think that we should, first of all, between us two, and then more broadly with our allies, ensure that we really maximize the leverage that we have with China to ensure that we can make some progress here. And just a final comment, I don't think this issue with the China Investment Treaty is that much of a big deal. I happen to think that the EU might have perhaps, waited a bit, but I understand why it needed to close it during the German presidency. We now need to put that behind us and really see how we can work together on this critical topic of WTO reform in China. With that, I'll end. I'll just think, look, I want to repeat, I'm very optimistic, I'm bullish, I think there's a lot to do, but we have a very short period of time to prove the case. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony, for this. And Daniela, perhaps let me turn to you now for a European reaction to some of these suggestions. I mean, Commissioner von der Leyen has been quite clear that indeed a sort of reviving of TTIP is not on the agenda. So I guess that on that there is transatlantic agreement. The question is whether there is agreement on the list of priorities, the fairly long list of priorities that Tony set out there, which really does, perhaps they're not as comprehensive as TTIP, but if you kind of add them all together, really do sort of amount to a pretty ambitious agenda. So Daniela, perhaps your sense, both on some of these bilateral steps as well as the more multilateral initiatives, what is your sense as to where Europeans are heading?
Well, thank you very much, Natalie. And let me thank you and your colleagues at EIE for hosting us today, and all participants in our strategy group who are here today to share their thoughts. This is a great opportunity. Thanks for that. So Tony shared the recommendations he also put down in his action plan, which is part of the report, and I highly recommend this really very thoroughly thought through piece with very practical recommendations, which we as a group discussed in depth. And my short answer to those recommendations is I do believe they work for both sides. That's also why they are so prominently featured in the report. So I don't want to go through them in detail, but I do want to pick up your question, Natalie, and that is where's Europe heading in all of this? And you also initially asked the question about the concept of strategic autonomy, which is mostly discussed in a security and defense context. But in the European debate, of course, we also discuss this in an economic, financial, and tech context. Why is this so? I think Europeans woke up over the past 4 years, realizing that we now live in a geo-economic world where our, at that time, most important partner, the United States, is using economic and financial tools against us to weaken us, but also to put pressure on European positions. Take, for instance, the EU attempt to save the JCPOA. And Europeans realized that we do not have the tools at our hands to actually pursue an independent foreign policy if we do not develop ourselves further, also in economic and financial terms. And this was, I believe, a crucial realization for Europeans. So the debate on strategic autonomy, or as we like to call it at the ERP when we work on those issues, the capacity to act, because we think that's far more hands-on and practical, this has advanced very considerably. The term strategic autonomy within the European Union is a disputed one because of it's much older than, of course, the debate that happened during Trump's 4 years. But under that impression that eventually the US could turn away from Europe, this debate reached a real sense of urgency among Europeans, with the fear that indeed, if we talk too much and too adamantly about our own strategic autonomy, this could be seen as being in competition to transatlantic relations. What I believe, and what we came down to as a group, where we discussed this really thoroughly over several sessions, is that it is in the interest of both Europe and the United States that Europe works on its own capacity to act. But we should do this as part of the transatlantic alliance. This is not a risk to the transatlantic alliance, but it actually makes us more attractive to America, so we hope. But it will also substantively enhance our contribution, not only to the bilateral relationship, but also to our joint agenda in the world. And China was mentioned here. And here I think that the clearest link can be drawn to Europe's need to develop more strongly in the sector of technology and be more competitive and define for itself a credible path forward as part of a transatlantic context, where we then not only develop our own competitiveness, but we leverage our own market power, our regulatory power, together with the United States, to be a standard setter, not only for ourselves, but globally. And this is where I come to your second big question, which is about addressing, I think you phrased it, the non-liberal world or autocracy. Of course, we are in a systemic competition. And from a European perspective, the situation now with Joe Biden in office is so much better. But still, we as Europeans don't have time to lose, because we have to be aware that this systemic competition plays out in many, many fields. And economic, financial, technological developments, as we see how, for instance, China uses all of these tools to undermine democratic resilience in a number of even EU member states, but also in our neighborhood. This is really part of a broader transatlantic agenda, where Europe, in first instance, has to improve its own resilience and be a more active and more forward-leaning partner to the United States. Let me end with one thought, and that is really, what does it take to make Europe a more powerful player internationally, and hence in the transatlantic alliance when it comes to economic and finance? Now, of course, trade is an EU competence, which is why this field works pretty well. Although I share all the doubts about the feasibility of a new TTIP agreement, because we have a very intense debate on the future of globalization, the way to shape trade deals, and so on. So I fully share all the concerns that Tony just had, but I also share his optimism that a more sectoral and a more focused approach will be possible, not only in the bilateral relationship across the Atlantic, but also vis-a-vis third parties. I guess this is very important. However, the EU needs to really work internally to produce the ability to act externally in other areas of economic integration. And the best example here is the currency. I just want to go back to the JCPOA debate, where we suddenly had a discussion in I guess, most European capitals and in Brussels. We need a stronger role for the euro. Yes, but this is nothing you can just wish for. If we want to do that, we have to consolidate our internal governance structures, and we really have to move towards a more integrated financial market and economy that sits behind this currency. And this is a deep integration agenda that Europe has to tackle internally before it can use the tools it has already to full effectiveness. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that, Daniela. And in fact, let me stay in Europe and travel from Berlin to Brussels or Bruges. I'm not quite sure. You know, given that you raised the question of autonomy, and of course Federica is the sort of godmother of European strategic autonomy with the global strategy.
Together with you, Natalie.
Well, okay, in the background. And perhaps so Federica, sort of making the transition also from the economics to the security. Your reflections both on this question of, you know, autonomy and transatlantic relationship, you know, are they two sides of the same coin or not? But also if you could reflect on this question of, you know, how to deal with authoritarian powers. I mean, when you were HRVP, you made a big point about the need to, you know, sort of have conversations, and at times even difficult conversations with powers with whom one does not share values. But at the same time, obviously, there is a risk. There is a risk that by engaging with such powers, we don't have an influence on them, but rather they have an influence on us. And here is also where we loop back to this question of our own democratic resilience. So perhaps also your reflections on how do we navigate these, fairly straight and complex straits between, living up to our values and in a sense, engaging pragmatically with the world as it is.
Yes, thanks, Natalie. I'll maybe start from this last point and then go back to the strategic autonomy chapter. First of all, greetings to all from Bruges, not Brussels, where I try to keep the students of the College of Europe busy without having them partying and breaking the laws. It's great to see you all and see many friends, even if virtually only. And thanks for organizing this. Well, I think that, as you rightly said, engaging and talking, at least for me, and this is also a natural feature of the Italian diplomatic style, is always a plus, is always something you should try to put in place. Also because if others want to have an influence on you, they don't necessarily need you to have a dialogue with them, they can have it in other ways. So the dialogue is not a channel to expose yourself to influence of others. It's rather the contrary, it's a channel through which you can pass your own messages, because Europeans and liberal democracies don't use or tend not to use other channels that are different than dialogue and diplomacy and political relations. So I've always been convinced that engaging, including with countries and regimes that are not easy at all, is part of the essence of the work that diplomacy needs to do, especially European diplomacy, provided that talking is not confused with compromising or with a certain assouplissement of the message. I think that the more you talk, the more you have to make sure that your messages are clear. And the paradox we have lived in these last 4 years with the Trump administration was that all of a sudden the United States didn't have dialogues anymore with difficult countries, and sometimes we're compromising on values. And the mix of these two things was exactly the opposite of what the Europeans were trying to do, meaning opening channels of dialogue, including on issues like human rights, with China, with Cuba, you name it, but making sure that the message was clear and there was no compromise on the values. So I think it is always worth it. I believe that because as I'm now completely free and I'm not representing anybody by myself, let me also point at the things that might be tricky and difficult, even if I share Tony's optimism about the honeymoon and beyond. I think one cannot underestimate the importance of having a Biden administration for us Europeans and for the rest of the world, apart from Americans, obviously. But I guess that on the entire topic of how to deal with countries that, let's put it this way, have different democratic standards than ours, to use an understatement. I share what Tony was saying. I don't see the investment agreements with China from the European side as the main problematic point, also because it was in the pipeline in the making since so much and so long. I think one of the key difficult issues might be Turkey, exactly because of the transatlantic nature of our military alliance, and exactly because of the sensitivities that are linked to Europe and European member states when it comes to Turkey. So I guess that would be probably not the most visible and relevant point, but probably one of the trickiest ones to tackle. Also for the role that Turkey has in the Middle East, in the Eastern Mediterranean, relations with the other countries of the region. And again, it's so sensitive, it's so vivid in the feelings of certain Europeans, at least, that I guess this might be one of the complicated elements. Having said that, then I believe that, personally, I believe that there is no other way in the world of today, rather than having a very pragmatic approach, file by file, interlocutor per interlocutor, see on which files you can find reasonable ways of cooperating whenever it's needed, and it could be the case even with countries that are very far away from your own approaches on some specific files. It can be climate, it can be nuclear non-proliferation, it can be whatever, or a specific conflict or crisis, keeping very clear the overall message about principle, values, democracy, liberal approaches to individual rights, and so on and so forth, and multilateralism. Going back to strategic autonomy, I would subscribe everything that Daniela has mentioned. And actually, my starting point on strategic autonomy is always in these days when the topic is coming back to the attention. We normally refer to strategic autonomy as a military or security-related concept. I think that in Europe, we have found out in the last 4 years that it is much less so than we thought of, and that what is really at stake is the financial and economic autonomy of the European Union, rather than the military and security one. First of all, because as I repeated an infinite number of times when I was in office and afterwards, for Europe, for the European Union, NATO is the security umbrella. It's in the treaties, it's written black on white, and there's no doubt about that. And whoever tries to turn this around is either not having a full knowledge of the European treaties and the dynamics, very good dynamics between the European Union and NATO at all levels, political, military, all levels, or is misusing a political argument for reasons that might be legitimate, but different than the ones that are mentioned. Again, when it comes to security and defense, I don't see any risk of Europe and the United States diverging because of the strength of NATO, which is there and is there to stay. And if it was put in question, it was not put in question on the European side in the last years, but on Washington's side. And thanks God, we had the Pentagon that was, taking care of the fact that this message was clarified every time that it needed to be clarified. But the question marks on the alliance were never coming from Europe in this, well, from one capital once, but in general terms, not from Europeans. But what we found out, as Daniela mentioned, in these last 4 years, has been something of a surprise. That is that even if Europe applies autonomy in the definition of its norms and rules and strategy, like, for instance, legitimate trade and investments with Iran or with Cuba, then our societies, banks, businesses, companies are not in the conditions to follow those autonomous rules and norms because they are too exposed and too interlinked with the American economic and financial environment. So it's not convenient for them to apply the norms and the rules they would be called to follow. Now, we have been discussing this already in the last years of my mandate. This is not a foreign policy issue. This is in the Commission, this is for Dombrovskis, clearly. But how does the European Union exercise its own strategic, economic, and financial autonomy without entering into a conflict or a competition with the United States on the financial and economic sector? I'm not someone that can give an answer to that, but I think this is the question of the day or the year or the decade. How do we do that? And as Daniela mentioned, I have personally been asked by many, in particular Asian foreign ministers, can we use the euro to buy Iranian oil or gas? And my answer had to be no. But why? Why? Until and unless this somehow finds a rational way out of the contradiction, I think we will be talking about strategic autonomy. We will maybe be applying some strategic autonomy when it comes to policy and also some industrial measures when it comes to defense. And I'll come one moment to that, if you allow me, Natalie, because I want to mention also a tricky point on this. But the real thing, which is how Europe uses the soft power by definition that it has the most, which is trade and investments, would be not in the hands of Brussels or Berlin or Paris or Rome or you name it, or Warsaw. How do you protect businesses that are doing investments that are legitimate for European norms and that are hit by US decisions that are taken outside of the EU. I think that the Biden administration might allow us to find a cooperative approach to this, because Natalie knows that well. I've always used the term cooperative autonomy because I believe that it would describe better the kind of approach Europeans have and should have, I think, always, which is to obviously define by ourselves our norms and regulations. This is the meaning of the word autonomy. Comes from that. You regulate yourself. You define yourself, which are your norms. But this doesn't mean that you have to do it against somebody else. You can do it together and even in coordination and cooperation with somebody else, which is the desired way in the European way. And then obviously, if you're on the other side of the phone, there's no one referring to Kissinger metaphor on the other side. If nobody picks up the phone in Washington, then at least you've tried to reach out. So I think that for Europeans, it's never a question of going alone if we have the choice of going together. But we have to be ready to go alone if on the other side the door is shut. Or even worse than that, if we are targeted with sanctions that, as Tony was mentioning, have very little reason to be imposed in the very first place towards a NATO ally. If I can say one word on this, on the military side, I think there is no doubt, as I mentioned, that between Europe and the United States, in general terms, in the transatlantic community, let's not forget Canada in all of this, there's a natural alignment of interests and of a natural push for cooperation on the military and security side, and this is framed perfectly well in the NATO framework. And I have no doubt at all about the strength of this, but there is one element that is potentially a conflictual one, and it is a real one, and it is disturbing for the American industry of the military and the security industry, weapons in particular and equipment. In the moment when Europeans develop their own instruments to incentivize cooperation on the European scale for the industrial production in the military field. Indeed, this is and puts an issue to the industry in the United States. This is a fact. This is a fact. Even if, as we have been clarifying hundreds of times, the European market remains an open market, contrary probably to the American one in certain cases, in any case, much more open. Still, competition is competition, and there might be an American industry, a sector of the American industry that doesn't look at the possibility for European industrial bases to be incentivized to work on an economy of scale in a positive manner. This is a reality of fact. But this has nothing to do with competition on security. This has something to do with competition on industry. And again, we go back to the economic field. It has nothing to do with security, with NATO, with defense, with military, with strategy, with crisis management, with Afghanistan. It has nothing to do with that, but it has to do with the industrial production. Yes. And this is an issue that is on the table and will need to be looked at somehow. I'll stop here because I think I've taken even too much time now, but happy to come back on comments and questions as we continue.
Well, thank you so much for that, Federica. I mean, in fact, you put it, I mean, I've been sort of thinking about this question quite a lot myself sort of in recent weeks, you know, when it comes to autonomy and the transatlantic relationship, you know, which are the sort of phony arguments and where instead is there, you know, and are there real questions to address? And I share exactly your view. I mean, the problem is not so much in the way in which this affects policy and security terms, or even more broadly foreign policy terms. Because I think when it comes to that, there is such a strong argument, and here I'll then like to sort of hear Nick's views, but such a strong argument to be made, which actually goes something along the lines of, given the way the world is changing, the Russias and the Chinas and the whatnot all over the place, it is precisely by building the capacity for greater European autonomy that one can help to strengthen the transatlantic relationship. And I'm very sort of deeply convinced about this. But at the same time, I think you put your finger on the fact that autonomy does actually open some real dilemmas, and they're not really in this more realist neck of the woods, but rather in a more liberal understanding of the world, which basically says that protectionism is not a good thing and that interdependence is a good thing, and that also looked at in intra-European terms, an excessive concentration of economic power in a few hands, read in a few member states, creates imbalances that are detrimental also to the European project. So I think if one sort of looks at it through this more industrial lens, it's not to say that autonomy should not be pursued, but I think it does pose real questions to be addressed. And on this, I'd really like to sort of go back to Cambridge across the Atlantic and bring Nick in. Sort of beyond reacting to anything you want to react on, perhaps, Nick, if you could also give us your sense of what is it, how should the Biden administration calibrate its message to Europeans? Because in a sense, much of the beginning of let's take greater responsibility in our hands was unfortunately triggered by the slap in the face received by the Trump administration. And it would be dreadful if the sort of byproduct of having a friend in Washington is Europeans lowering their guard, particularly when it comes to defense issues. So Nick, perhaps if you could also bring in sort of some reflections as to how, what exactly is the message that the Biden administration should send to Europeans?
Well, Natalie, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see so many friends, and good morning to all of us in the States. Natalie, I wanted to first start by just paying our condolences to you and Federica and the other Italians on the murder of your ambassador, Luca Antanasio, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the murder of the member of the Carabinieri who died with him. What a tragedy. And for such a young, vibrant diplomat to be struck down. And it just shows how dangerous this world is for all of us. So condolences from all of us on the American side. And thank you for organizing this. Thanks to your institute for organizing it. I certainly want to thank the members of our group that produced the report Stronger Together. It's a European-American group. It's a joint group. It wasn't Europeans dictating to Americans or vice versa, as sometimes happens. We tried over 1 year with Daniela leading us in many of these discussions and with us trying to help to determine a joint path forward. And I thank all the members here, you, Daniela, as our co-chair, certainly Federica and Natalie, Christian and Sophia, who are here. And on the American side, Tony, of course, and Catherine and Tori. We have two members of our group who are now serving. Well, one is currently serving the Biden administration, Amanda Sloat, who is Senior Director for Europe at the National Security Council at the White House, and Victoria Nuland has been nominated to be our senior diplomat, career diplomat, as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. So we are missing them, but it does show that we had a good group working on this. And finally, I just want to say how pleased we are that Federica is a senior fellow in our program at Harvard Kennedy School. She can't visit the campus right now for obvious reasons, but we're looking forward to that. And she's just had office hours with our students this morning. And we're also want to congratulate Daniela, who has just become a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. And it's really going to strengthen our European program here. And Natalie is going to be visiting as a visiting professor, starting, we hope, pandemic willing, in September. So we've got a strong team. Natalie, just a couple of points, because I think we want to get on in the conversation and hear from many of the people who are online. First, I think we should take a moment and I certainly want to do it in the American side, and revel and savor the new positive relationship between the European Union and the United States and NATO. We saw it last Friday. We saw it with Macron and Merkel and Boris Johnson and Jens Stoltenberg and Charles Michel and Joe Biden really on the same page at the Munich Security Conference on nearly, but not all, every issue. And I think as an internationalist, I'm certainly proud that the Biden administration has returned to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, returned to the World Health Organization, returned, and Federica led these, the Iran nuclear negotiations, at least indicated that the United States would like to sit down with Iran as well as with the EU and Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China. And then the G7 is working again, this time under Boris Johnson's leadership. This is good. This is a big change, as we all know from the last 4 years. And so we're feeling positive on our side. That's point one. Point two, are we together on Russia? I hope so, but I'm not sure. The Solar Winds Act has had a profound impact here in turning people even more against Russia than we had been in the past. It's the most significant hack ever against the United States, against our government, and against many of our major tech companies. Navalny and the attempted murder of Navalny, and now his imprisonment in the Russian gulag, that's had a big impact on Europe and on our side of the Atlantic as well. The Ukraine sanctions. Will Europe maintain the Ukraine sanctions post-Merkel? I hope so, because in the States, here in the US, I think in both of our political parties, there's strong support for continued sanctions of Russia. My sense of the Biden team 5 weeks in, beginning with the president, there's not going to be any reset with Russia. This is a very tough-minded American policy to push Russia back on the cyber attack, certainly to hold our ground in Ukraine and supporting Ukraine and Georgia, and certainly, as the president said, to cancel the troop withdrawals that Donald Trump had ordered from Germany and to actually reinforce NATO. Can we stay together? Will Europe be united is a question I have. That's point two. Point three, on China, it was the one issue on Friday as I listened to all the speeches where I felt some of the Europeans, maybe Europe divided, and America wishing that Europe would have a stronger policy toward and united policy towards China. If we think of 5G, where the UK, the US, Japan, India, Australia all have said no to Huawei. So I think we're waiting, what will Europe's answer be on Huawei and 5G? On trade, there was this, Tony's the expert. I think it was a mistake for the European Union to go ahead with the investment agreement in late December, because China is the largest and most powerful violator of the rules of the WTO, with its subsidies to its companies, the dumping, the patents, the intellectual property infringements, the unfair trade practices which threaten Europe as well as North America, as well as the East Asian countries. And so can the US and the EU, and perhaps with Japan, coalesce? That would be 60% of global GDP, to push the Chinese to adhere to fair trade practices. I didn't hear that. And I'm not even sure President Macron even mentioned China very much in his speech. Beyond the trade issues, we have the destruction of Hong Kong's democracy over the summer and autumn, and now on trial, some of the Martin Lee and Jimmy Lai, some of the most profoundly important democracy activists in Hong Kong are on trial. And to see the genocide against the Uyghurs, and that's the word that Tony Blinken and Mike Pompeo both used, and I certainly agree with it, a genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. We have got to have a united North American Europe policy on China, and we don't have it yet. So that needs to be worked on. My sense is that as the US looks overseas, President Biden, Japan and South Korea and Australia and India working closely with us are all in the same camp. But my sense is that Europe and America have a long way to go. And so let's talk about that. Final point on strategic autonomy. I agree with Federica. NATO's too strong. NATO is strong, and we needn't worry that NATO is going to be undermined by a mantra or two words. And I think we'll see NATO strengthen because of Russia over the next several months and several years. The words are strange, at least in American English, and at least for me. Strategic autonomy really means separation. Is that really what the French mean? Daniela would know more about this than I do, having been involved in a lot of these discussions between Germany and France. Many of you will know more than I do. But I think the words are important. I think we would have preferred something else. If Europe wants to signal, the EU especially, that it wants to build its defense capacity to be able to act when it needs to alone, I think Americans would support that totally. If Europe wants to expand defense budgets, as many Europeans are doing, and Chancellor Merkel said, Germany's gone from 1.1 to 1.5% of GDP on defense in just the last 6 years. That's a real accomplishment. We should applaud that from Germany. Then the United States is going to be very supportive. If there is a sense, however, that the real goal by some in Europe is to weaken NATO, then that's going to be opposed. But I remain optimistic. I agree with Federica. I think this is going to be okay. And it would be hypocritical of Americans to be too concerned about this when we've been complaining about the lack of European defense spending. The trend lines are, and Donald Trump never told the truth about this. Since 2014, every European member of NATO has been spending more on defense. The trend lines are up, they're positive, and we should congratulate the Europeans on that. So I'm optimistic that we can work out problems of theology in the NATO-EU relationship. And in general, I'm very optimistic about this relationship. So thank you to everybody who worked on this report. I think it's a good report. It deals with Nord Stream, it deals with technology issues, it deals with all the issues that Tony talked about that are so important. Thank you for having us this afternoon.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for that. And perhaps let me now, in a moment I'll come back to some of the points that you were making, but let me now please invite, some of you already have, but invite those of you who haven't and may have questions to please contribute them through the chat function. Let me also remind everyone that I think in a while, if it has not already been done, the link to the report for those of you who have not read it will also be sent through the chat function. And as people collect their thoughts, perhaps, Nick, on the Russia and China question. I mean, on the Russia question, I actually think that there is going to be very broad transatlantic agreement. I don't think that this is going to be an area where we're going to see the kind of disagreements, both intra-European and transatlantic, that existed in the past. For the simple reason that, in a sense, kind of Vladimir Putin has managed to achieve what Europeans very rarely manage to achieve, which is a European consensus. I mean, there has been increasing convergence within the EU in recent years over what some would define as a more hardline, what others would define as a more realistic position towards Russia. So there, I'm fairly confident that that we're basically going to be on the same page. I think when it comes to China, there is more work to be done, because I do think that we do come to the China question from slightly different standpoints. You know, for the US, it's a story about rivalry, geopolitical rivalry. Europeans don't, in a sense, have those kind of ambitions. So in a sense, for Europeans, it's more a question of ensuring that China's rise does not, given that it is an authoritarian power, does not impinge on our internal norms, rules, practices in a way which we have been seeing in areas, particularly in the economic realm, as well as obviously digital. So I think that kind of suggests that there is going to be broad convergence transatlantically, but we're not going to be entirely. I mean, I think there is a lot of dialogue basically that needs to take place to ensure that there is clarity on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, let me turn to some of the questions that have already been seeing in the chat function. So there's the first question by Marco Monaco, and I'd like to bring in perhaps Sophia Becker or Christian Mölling on this, given that it does regard the more defense aspects, and this kind of allows me also to bring in some of the other authors of the report. So the question is, in your opinion, will the Transatlantic Alliance find a renewed importance in the context of the elaboration of the strategic compass by the EU in 2021-22, or will the document further reinforce the idea of Europe as an independent security and foreign policy actor? I don't know if Sophia, perhaps you may want to come in first on this, and then perhaps Christian for a couple of remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. I think what I would say to this question is, much like Federica and others have already said, in terms of strategic autonomy, I don't think that the strategic compass in itself would be something that moves Europe further away from NATO or the United States or the Transatlantic Alliance. I think it's rather an opportunity for Europe to strengthen its strategic muscle. And if we think about another process that is currently underway, the NATO 2030 process and the recommendation that was made with the strategic concept that's supposed to be renewed, I think there's actually an opportunity for working jointly on these kinds of things between the EU and NATO. So I don't really see the strategic compass as being something that is driving a wedge in the Transatlantic Alliance, but maybe Christian has another thought on this.
Christian.
I fully side with Sophia's statement on that. It will be the opportunity, but also the challenge to bring EU and NATO closer together against all the institutional challenges that it have with Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus in the official settings. So the question is, how can those member states who are members of EU and NATO at the same time possibly informally drive this ahead? Because this has been the stumbling block for, I don't know, decades, 100 years. It feels like 100 years that we haven't made way forward. But this is about the security of Europe. And I think it should be the Europeans that shape this.
Okay, so let me now turn. Now there's a question by Herman Villagram, and perhaps let me paraphrase this and pose this to Federica, because it's, in a sense, it's a more intra-European question, I guess, which is, sort of taking the Turkey, Brexit, sort of long-term implications, Russia, China, sort of a plateful of issues on which Europeans tend to be divided. I mean, I guess the question really is, what scope do you see for greater European convergence on some of these kind of tricky questions?
This is the question I've been answering to for the 5 years of my mandate. Happy to continue. And I will not surprise you, because my answer will be exactly the same as the one that I was giving when I was in office. First, in Europe, you have a variety of views. You have a variety of voices. I've always hated when people were telling me you have to speak with one voice. No, we have to speak with all the voices we have, because this is our richness. This is even an asset, because some voices can be heard differently in different parts of the world. The important thing is that we sing the same song. So the plurality of voices is fine. The plurality of backgrounds, of starting points is natural. It's even good. The important thing is what you get out of it in terms of common decisions, what to do together. And I have to say, foreign policy and also defense and security is the field where divisions are less relevant than other fields of internal decisions for the European Union. Think of the economic, financial, the migration-related ones, where actually divisions are there and are serious. In my 5 years in office, I never really experienced a lack of unity, and we still decided everything, still at 28 until I left, by unanimity, and never once having monthly councils, never once we didn't manage to have a common decision out of lack of unanimity. Obviously, this requires a lot of work, preparation, listening, taking into consideration different points of view, adjusting the sense of direction. But this is, again, this is the good point of being many, and that you can take into consideration different points of view, and this might lead you to a better decision at the end of the day. Having said that, I think that on top of it, if we manage to keep unity under the pressure of these 4 years, which have been probably the most difficult ones for Europeans, because you can easily imagine the kind of pressure that was coming on European capitals from Washington on issues like Jerusalem or the Iran nuclear deal. And still the European Union kept unity on its positions on very sensitive issues with very open and intrusive pressure from Washington, which is the place from which it's very difficult for us to resist pressure because we are natural friends. Pressure from other sides, you are trained to reject or resist. But pressure that comes from your friends and allies, it's a bit more complicated to handle that. And if we've managed to keep the compass and the unity over these last 4 years on foreign policy, I think that the test is successfully passed. If I can, Natalie, there's one element that worries me a little bit, and that is, and I agree perfectly with Nick on the fact that maybe the words strategic autonomy are not appropriate to describe the work that has been done on, at least on defense and security issues in Europe. Because actually what is there is for the first time a real and serious effort to use the economy of scale that is in the DNA of the European project also on defense and security, which is good for NATO and good for the United States. It's basically filling the gap of the shortcomings of the fragmentation of investment on the European defense side. But there is one thing that worries me a little bit, and again, we are in a celebration mood and we're happy. But what worries me a little bit is this risk that we run on both sides of thinking that being happy and relieved and satisfied because America is back, and we are. I think that, by the way, just today, Blinken was joining the ministers of foreign affairs at the Foreign Affairs Council with an online conversation with them in Brussels. So that is great, but I'm afraid that, as Nick was saying, there are some issues that beyond that need to be looked at because the America is back sense of happiness and relief is great, but it's not going to last forever and to solve all the problems we have in front of us. It's back, good, and so what? Where do we move from here? And I think that second chapter, probably it's a bit too early for the politics to handle that, but we are free to look a little bit ahead and see what is there that is going to come on the agenda. As Tony was mentioning, there are some issues, there is a common agenda to be rebuilt. Because here I'm going to say something that is going to be unpleasant for our American friends, but I think they are aware of this. In Europe, if any American comes now and tell us what we need to do, it wouldn't go down well. Because there is a perception in the public opinion, first of all, that there's no lessons to be taught here because we have lost confidence. And it's something that hurts me to say, but this is the reality of facts. And so I think that we need to re-establish not only a common agenda, but also common understanding of how we work together. Because just saying we are back and this is what we think should be done is not going to make the trick in Europe anymore, I'm afraid. Because we've gone through several shocks in the last 4 years that need to be somehow, the wounds need to be healed. And that will require a little bit of energy on both sides and of smart thinking. Sorry to add a bitter note to the over-enthusiasm that I have in the first place. But I see that this might become an issue at a certain moment if we don't address it and if we don't help leaderships to address it on both sides.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, the transatlantic relationship has obviously been through many ups and downs over the decades, but they were always agreements or disagreements within the family. and the trauma of feeling over the last 4 years that we were not treated as family, in fact, we were treated as adversaries, I think will take some time to heal. I completely agree with you. Now let me turn to a question by Luis Alberto Orellana to Tony Garner, but perhaps Catherine, you may want to chip in on this as well, given that it touches on digital questions. So one question is, what is the perception of Gaia X, the European Initiative on Cloud Sovereignty in Washington? And a second, what about 5G issue with China? So Tony, if you could perhaps say a few words on those, and perhaps I could also bring in Catherine on this.
I think Tony may have had to leave us early, so I'm happy
okay. So Catherine,
to jump into the breach, as we might say. Look, I mean, we've had this discussion now on redefining the concept of sovereignty, and where it really doesn't work in its perhaps semantic description is on issues of technology. We've all alluded to the power that the European Union has developed, the muscle rightly has developed in the regulatory sphere. I think that's an incredible asset. I think, again, as Tony alluded to, timing with respect to the digital tax issues will be everything. But here, again, I think Europe is coming to the table with something strong. We see now that the GDPR is an international standard setter. California has its own version of it. I think you'll see that that pull has been an incredible, or will be ultimately an asset for the transatlantic relationship. But where it doesn't work is when you think about how technology functions in this world, and specifically to Gaia X, the idea that by closing off a system that you could catch up endemically by using European technology, and you could catch up with on the power of European R&D itself, that you would cut yourself off from the power of Silicon Valley and other places, is frankly a strategic mistake. And so the good news on that is that, of course, Microsoft has now joined Gaia X, and that the concept of Gaia X is that of a platform. I think it's undersold in its political relevance, as long as it stays open to technology solutions that are truly globally fettered, then I think it could be, you know, it could serve to be a very interesting opportunity transatlantically, again, to remove data storage capacities, management, privacy issues into a wider transatlantic dialogue. And so I, for one, was very happy to see Microsoft extend to that. And on the Huawei question, I mean, that leads directly, Federica, Tony, everybody has mentioned this lack of a joint industrial policy in Europe, and certainly key joint industrial planning and thought processes in the transatlantic sphere. Here, we have a very concrete issue on which we could work together. We're very reluctant to push industrial champions on the European sphere because of our competition rules, things that we have long established to be norms within the European Union. And yet, and it's odd for me to praise developments in the Trump administration, but this idea that Nokia and Ericsson should have a buy first piece on some of the American procurement of technologies when it comes to 5G is actually a good thing. And the developments that we're seeing in the US software industry on 5G solutions, paired with some of the things that we might be doing together on pushing hardware solutions that come from ultimately a European shore, I think are very concrete issues that we can continue to put up. And Nick mentioned that, you know, the Europeans are wrestling with what to do with 5G, but we've seen progress over the summer. The Belgians have decided to remove 5G. There's a discussion on whether or not 5G couldn't be included into the, you know, safe, secure technology of that order. 5G, 6G couldn't be included in the NATO 2% threshold spending to effectively de-China-ize intelligence systems, telecommunication systems. It's going to need a different set of dialogue, if you will, or a different approach, because again, the Europeans have treated all issues around 5G as a telecommunications issue, whereas the Americans look at this as a security issue. And I happen to agree with that, even though I'm German-American. I think it's vital to see the security implications there. So even though these issues are complex and somewhat, you know, technical, I do think that we're at a moment here where we're putting a lot of our joint values back on the table to discuss how do we actually think about this, that we can actually move forward apace. And I was heartened by the fact that the EU Commission announced, I believe today or yesterday, that they were going to, really use their node structure and power to look at emerging technologies and AI together and put that competence on the table. And I think that is actually an area where we could see very rapid progress. And we need to see rapid progress because, as Nick and others have noted here, China is not sleeping. They have moved ahead rapidly at creating closed data harvesting systems. They're moving into, terrains where Europe and the United States should be the norm and standard setters, I think particularly of the global South. So here's something that, we really have an agenda that we can tackle together. And now is really the time to do it, and to do it apace, and to make that priorities of executive action, both at the heart of the White House, and we've seen moves to make that happen on cyber and on technology integrated issues. And the European Union needs to meet that with a, frankly, firm handshake, meaning to say that needs to be anchored at the heart of the Commission, not split over a number of commissioners. We need to see something that's joint and powerful, and frankly, that goes beyond the EU Tech and Trade Council. That would be my ardent wish.
Well, thank you, Catherine. And I have loads of questions here coming up. So let me ask, I'm going to try and get as many as possible in the 15 minutes that, 10 minutes we have left. So Nick, let me perhaps throw two to you. One by Plamen Pantev and a second by Dmitry Poletayev. And the first is really about sort of anti-terrorism and ISIS, whereas the second is about disinformation. And in particular, Russian-sponsored disinformation. If you could perhaps say a few words as to what can be done transatlantically on both counterterrorism and disinformation.
Well, thank you, Natalie. If the question was on ISIS, that battle is not yet finished. And I think that, we were able in the Obama and Trump administrations, working with our European allies, to do a lot of damage to the Islamic State. It was a very successful campaign, but it's not finished. Just as the Al-Qaeda successor groups continue to make their presence felt, not just in the Middle East, but also in South Asia and places like Afghanistan. So we have some major issues ahead of us. Certainly, those are two principal ones, and the other is Afghanistan. The NATO defense ministers met last week. This is going to be a very tough situation. It's ironic to me. I was ambassador to NATO when we made NATO the operational force in 2003 in Afghanistan, and when we sent our first 8,500 troops there. We now have twice the number of European troops in Afghanistan as American troops. And President Biden's facing a very difficult decision and a May 1 deadline, whether or not to draw down those forces further or whether to keep them as they are or build them up. There's been a new report. It was a public commission headed by our former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Joe Dunford, and former senator from New Hampshire, Kelly Ayotte, and they just recommended that the United States maintain its military forces and perhaps even reconfigure them so that we can protect the Afghan government from a very aggressive Taliban. This is a joint decision we're going to have to make with NATO. I think Jens Stoltenberg was very right to highlight this in his remarks on Friday at the Munich Security Conference, and we're all in this together. Italy, the United States, and all the other members of the alliance. So the questioner is right. These are major issues of security for Europe and North America that we've got to work out together. Second, on Russian disinformation, this is going to be a major battle. It's why in a country that's my country, completely divided politically between Republicans and Democrats, both parties agree that we've got to be very tough-minded vis-a-vis Russia, because of Russia's invasion of our social media sphere during the last two elections, and because of this major cyber attack of the end of the autumn and early this year, 2021, not just against the State Department and other agencies of the US government, but against our major tech companies. There has to be a combined European, Canadian, American response to this, both in the social media dimension, but also in the cyber, the attacks on the strengths of our system. And I was I was heartened by Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, who said publicly late last week, there will be an American response to Putin. So for all those who might hope, and I know there's some in Italy, for some kind of relaxation of tensions with Russia, certainly from the American side, it's not going to happen, given everything that Putin has done to poison the well in our relationship. And we would hope that Europeans and the new Italian government, and we very much admire the new Italian prime minister, would be tough-minded as well on this issue.
Well, thanks, Nick. Now I realise we're running out of time. If you promise to give me 1 minute answers, I wanted to bring in a couple of two final questions, perhaps one to Daniela and one to Tori, so that we can also get deeper into some of these Asian questions. To Daniela, a question from Michael Lee, which whether we should be supporting engagement with Russia and China on vaccines, whether this is acceptable given the issues of principle that we have with these countries. And perhaps, Tori, to you, if you could say a few words as to a question by Federica Lorusso, again, I'm paraphrasing here, if you could give your sense as to what the transatlantic relationship should do when it comes to the Indo-Pacific.
Yes, thank you very much, Natalie. Let me first say, as a backdrop to the answer I'll be giving in a moment, I'm firmly with Nick with regards to his push on Europeans to be very clear on their position on Russia and on China. And this is both a national debate in a number of member states to be had. And France, for instance, is one of them. Germany is another one. And then on the European level, we have to be clearer, to be reliable partners. And we have to also, once we have a clearer and more fruitful position, we have to be ready to act more quickly. And I share Natalie's analysis that Europe has moved quite a bit on both cases, both on Russia and both on China, but further clarification is needed, and also further evaluation on which issues Europe will really be more affirmative vis-a-vis those two countries. Now, I think in both cases, both China and Russia, there will have to be a double strategy on being very clear on certain issues where we want them to move and where we claim, for instance, in economic issues or on human rights issues or security and defense issues, where Europeans and Americans have aligned positions and can be very clear on that. But then there's also a cooperative agenda, both with China and with Russia. And the major topic going forward here is climate change. So we will have to engage with Beijing and Moscow on that issue. And I would say fighting the pandemic and cooperating on vaccine, not only development, but also distribution, from my perspective, would fall into that category if we are able to make sure that there are red lines that we are not willing to cross and that we are ready to use instruments to show that we don't put up with behavior. And the Navalny case is one most recent example where the Europeans have moved, maybe not quite as fast enough, but they have moved. And Germany has to answer certain questions, and Nord Stream didn't cover much ground in the discussion today. But this is also a big question mark with regards to the fundamental positioning of not only this, but also the next German government on Russia.
Thank you, Daniela. Tori.
Thank you, Natalie. I won't use my 60 seconds to outline a full Indo-Pacific strategy, but what I will do is make 2 points where I think the transatlantic allies can advance shared goals in the Indo-Pacific. The first is on how we advance alternatives to China's Belt Road Initiative. This has a lot of impact in the Indo-Pacific, and I think the way that China advances its infrastructure projects in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere increases debt in recipient countries, and it does very little to advance strong climate or labor measures. I think this is where Americans and Europeans can really put our heads together to provide alternatives, transparent, strong democratic standards, strong labor standards alternatives to infrastructure and financing projects in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And the second point I'll make is how we use our collective voices at multilateral institutions. You know, as we see China increase its aggressive and assertive actions in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, I think Americans and Europeans can use its collective voice to push back on these efforts at the United Nations and also in international courts. And those are two areas that we make in our report. And finally, I think at the UN, you know, an area where, and an institution where the United States has taken a step back in the Trump administration, this is where we can be pushing back more on Chinese human rights abuses in Xinjiang and also freedoms in Hong Kong. And this is in part an Indo-Pacific strategy, but also just an area where I think we can advance to more values-based foreign policy.
Well, thank you so much for that, Tori. Well, thanks to all of you, and in fact, apologies to all of those to whom I have not been able to turn to. I think it's testimony to the fact that it has been an incredibly rich debate. So without further ado, I think this is only the beginning of a conversation, of a transatlantic conversation that will probably go on for the next few years under the Biden administration. Thanks to Nick, thanks to Daniela, to Federica, to Tony, who's left us, to Catherine, to Tori, to Sophia, to Christian, and thanks to all of you for being with us this morning/afternoon. Thanks to all.